Hello and welcome back to followers of the Casper journey. Today's video is going to be Casper, money solved. In this video, we're going to be exploring how Casper has solved the trilemma twice, both the cryptocurrency trilemma and the money trilemma. This video is going to be a presentation of the points and ideas argued in this article here, A Path to Digital Silver as a Stateless World Reserve Currency, a history and philosophy of the money trilemma. And this is an article written on casmedia.com, which I will link down in the description. And this article was written by Nicholas and Shay, who are both great minds in the Casper space. So do me a big favor, guys, and go and follow both of them on X. I will put their profiles down in the description. So after you've given them a follow, don't forget to like and subscribe, and also turn on post notifications so that you don't miss any future videos. So to begin with, we are going to explore proto-ledger money. Money, in its earliest form, began as a social ledger, with the balances of the ledger contained in memory only. And this would have been within small tribes where food, tools, goods and services would have been traded with known trusted members of the community, and it was relatively easy to keep track of who was pulling their weight and who was not pulling their weight. However, with increased complexity of societies came the need to keep a physical record of ownership, and that is when the ledger switched from a memory-based social ledger to a physical written ledger. And these ledgers that you see on the bottom here are as old as 5,000 years old, and in their earliest form contained images of goods and services such as grain, with a number of stamped holes next to that image depicting how much of this item was owed. And along with clay tablet ledgers, there also existed clay bead ledgers, which is seen in the top right there, which also served as a ledger to keep a tally of who owed what. And this form of proto-ledger money works intra-community, so that is within communities. And the reason for that is because if you abuse the trust in the ledger, you will be blacklisted and people will know that you are not to be trusted to trade with in the future. So the cost of breaking the trust of the ledger is high, and you almost certainly had more to lose than you had to gain from breaking trust in the ledger. However, as separate communities started trading with one another, so inter-community trade, humans could no longer rely on trust-based ledgers, because now the cost of breaking the trust in the ledger is low, and you potentially have more to gain from breaking the trust in the ledger than you do by playing by the rules of the ledger, because there is no guarantee that you will ever have to use that ledger again. And so because of this, trustless forms of ledgers were needed, and these came in the form of commodity money. And early proto-commodity money all had three common characteristics. It was secure from theft or loss, as the items were easily carried or easily hidden. They all had an unforgeable costliness to them, which gave them value. These items could not be easily forged or easily replicated, and the value could be measured by relatively simple observation, with these forms of money being relatively uniform and a relatively good unit of account. So 4 examples we have here. On the bottom left, we have cowrie shells, which were used throughout Asia, Africa, and Europe. On the bottom right, we have wampum shells, which were primarily used in North America. On the top right, we have agri beads, which were primarily used in Africa and were made of glass. And on the top left, we have potentially the earliest form of proto-money ever discovered, which are dated back to 100,000 years ago and were found in Blombo's cave in South Africa. So over time, as human societies advanced technologically, these forms of proto-money became easier and easier to produce and required less energy to produce. In other words, their unforgeable costliness was reduced. So, for example, European explorers and traders were able to flood the agri-bead market by reproducing their glass-like characteristics. And the Europeans who could create glass beads relatively easily and relatively cheaply could then pay for African goods and services for very low cost. And in the mid-1600s, European settlers in North America noticed the Native Americans using wampum shells as money and noticed how valuable they were, and eventually inflated away their supply by harvesting many more wampum shells. And perhaps the most well-known and the most notable was the rye stones. So in 1871, David O'Keefe attempted to recreate the rye stones, which were used on the island of Yap, using more modern tools and technology, and tried to exchange these rye stones for the island's coconut supply. And the islanders initially rejected these stones and attempted to trade only the old traditional stones, but eventually this model broke down because the unforgeable costliness of the rye stones no longer existed. So the question arises, why is money needed in the first place? Because if you don't have a system of money or some sort of system of keeping track of who owes what, then you have to use barter. And barter is almost impossible due to something called the double coincidence of wants, where trade is only possible if you have what they want and they have what you want. And this can be broken down into a threefold problem: a lack of coincidence in scale, a lack of coincidence in time, and a lack of coincidence in space. And so we're going to go over an example of these three double coincidences. And for this, we are going to use the example of trading bread for a car. So the coincidence of scale: you can't fractionalize a car for a few loaves of bread. There's no way to sell just one small portion of the car. And because the car at current exchange rates would be worth tens of thousands of loaves of bread, it is unlikely that the car owner wants a full warehouse of bread in exchange for their car. And so the coincidence of time pertains to the different durabilities of these two items. So while the car is durable, the bread is perishable. And the bread may be stale before the deal is even completed, meaning that the car owner has just lost all of their value. And there is also the double coincidence of space, where the car owner may not be in the same physical location as the bread owner, and it would be impractical to ship a warehouse of bread to the car owner. However, it would at least be possible. Whereas something like a house for a house swap, that would be impossible to transact through space. And the house swap is only really possible if both parties live in the same area, or both parties want to move to the area where the other house is. So because of these three double coincidences making trade high friction, the need for a medium of exchange rises, and having that double coincidence of wants becomes even more unlikely as the complexity of economies grow. So if we have an arbitrary number n of different goods, and in this case we will take 8 goods, then in a barter system there will be an n multiplied by n minus 1 divided by 2 number of trading pairs. So for example, 8 multiplied by 7 divided by 2 gives you 28 trading pairs. Whereas in a system with money, or a universal medium of exchange, the relevant number of tradable goods is reduced by a factor of n, where only n minus 1 potential pairs of goods remain. So in this example on the right, with 9 goods in the economy, the 8 goods, and also the universal medium of exchange, or the form of money, there are 8 trading pairs. So a system with 9 goods has only 8 trading pairs. And therefore, for societies and economies to increase in complexity, there had to be a money, and there had to be that universal medium of exchange. And this universal medium of exchange is money. And money acts as the medium of the value. Therefore, money represents a claim on value and is not the actual value itself. Money almost acts as a mirror for the real economy, with all of the money representing a claim on all of the goods and services and value in that economy. And almost anything can be used as the medium of exchange. However, certain attributes determine if it will be a good form of money or not. And the medium of exchange functions as money if it is used solely for the exchange of other goods. It is not used or purchased for its own consumption or for the production of other goods, such as an investment. And that makes investments and capital goods distinct from money because they provide a return and involve a level of risk. Whereas money, you inherently do not expect a return from money. And because you are not trying to get a yield or a return on your money, it is therefore the less risky thing to hold. And so this brings us onto salability and the money trilemma. So salability is the ease with which a good can be exchanged on the market, or in other words, it lowers the economic costs and it lowers the frictions for exchanging this item. And so for a medium of exchange to be a good money, it must be saleable across the 3 coincidences. So scale, how easily can the money be divided into smaller units or grouped into one larger unit? The coincidence of space, so how easily can it be transported across distances, also commonly known as portability, and also across the coincidence of time, so how easily can it be transported through time or retain the claim on the value into the future. And this historically has been the most difficult coincidence to achieve. And previously, no form of money has been able to fulfill all 3 of these coincidences. So salability across time historically has been the most difficult one to achieve, and that is because it requires 3 necessary conditions to be met. The first is unforgeable costliness, so it is expensive and difficult to produce. It needs a mechanism to restrict forgery, replication, or production. and it needs an objective set supply rather than a human subjective one. And salability across time can be quantified using the stock to flow ratio, which we will get onto later in the video. And so you may be thinking that the store of value and medium of exchange functions of money, or in other words, salability across time and salability across space, could be fulfilled by different assets. But in truth, they are inextricably linked. So as Ludwig von Mises says, individuals store their value in a good carrying the least risk and can be liquidated easily and cheaply. As the uncertainty for the future drives the demand for money, a medium of exchange should therefore be a good store of value. And because money acts as a mirror for the real economy and represents a claim on the real economy and on real value, and is not the actual value itself, it is only useful if it can be readily exchanged for the real economy. You know, someone stranded on a desert island with a huge pile of gold, while that gold may be recognized as valuable around the world, if there is no way to exchange that gold for goods or services, then it is essentially worthless to the shipwrecked man. And so it may seem like a waste of time creating money, such as our ancestors producing this proto-money, when instead that time could be used for economic production and creating real-world value. However, making money with an unforgeable costliness, while initially you make no return on the energy spent creating that money. Because of its unforgeable costliness, every single transaction, it recoups the value and prevents further loss of energy, and is akin to fixing the leaking fuel tank of a car because it prevents future loss of energy. And having a good money which has achieved acceptability allows economies to be more efficient and therefore grow larger, measuring all goods and services with one unit. And therefore, the good that is the most saleable across those three areas of time, space, and scales, therefore becomes the money of societies, with the less saleable goods being rejected over time. And so this brings us onto metals as money, because over time, all of these other proto-monies that were used lost their unforgeable costliness, whereas gold and silver emerged as the commodity monies of choice due to them having the greatest salability across those three mediums, particularly salability across time, having high stock-to-flow ratios and maintaining their unforgeable costliness. And gold and silver played slightly different roles throughout history, with gold having a higher stock-to-flow ratio and a higher salability across time than silver did, and therefore was used primarily as a store of value used by the wealthy for larger purchases. However, due to silver's higher salability across scale and greater divisibility, it functioned more like a medium of exchange and therefore more like money. And this was noted by Milton Friedman, who said, "The major monetary metal in history is silver, not gold." And silver was used as money as far back as the civilization of Mesopotamia, which had a dual monetary system of both silver and grain. And silver was primarily the good which was used for international trade, especially with the Greeks, and this international trade sped up its international adoption as money. And silver was also used in ancient China, and this is also possibly the first ever instance of fiat money, with Fei Pao notes being issued redeemable for the silver. However, like always, eventually the silver peg was broken and hyperinflation of the fiat occurred, and silver also functioned as the first world reserve currency in the form of the Spanish peso. However, due to silver's relatively low value per unit of mass, transportation was cumbersome and slow, and this was especially true for the British when they were trying to safeguard their gold and silver by transporting it across the Atlantic to store in Canada during World War I. But the Atlantic was infested with German U-boats at the time. And because silver had a high velocity of money, coins were quickly prone to counterfeiting, and debasement occurred as rulers reduced the metallic quality of the coins, reducing the overall amount of silver in a coin but keeping it the same weight, therefore inflating the supply during times of war or other emergencies. And therefore, it lacked that restriction mechanism against policy-making forces to maintain salability across space and also salability across time. And so out of the two monetary metals, gold won in the battle for money, and eventually the gold standard was adopted by the world. And in the book Globalizing Capital, A History of the International Monetary System, Barry Eichengreen essentially argues that gold won out by accident. In 1717, England's master of the mint, also known as Isaac Newton, set the official ratio of silver to gold too low, and as a result, due to Gresham's law, most silver coins went out of circulation, and therefore gold gained dominance. However, it was also likely due to banking solving the divisibility issue of gold, because using paper claims on gold instead of actual physical gold itself solved the divisibility issue, and now gold was as divisible as silver and with a higher stock to flow. Or in other words, it became as saleable across scales as silver, but it remained more saleable across time. However, with the gold standard came the rise of fractional reserve banking. Initially, banks purely acted as a safe place to store commodity money such as gold and silver, and also to facilitate loans and act as the middleman between investors who wanted to borrow money and savers who wanted to make a yield on their money. As this was a service, banks would charge to store gold and silver with them. However, over time, banks realised that at any one time, not everybody would want to redeem their claims on the gold deposits, so they could lend out more gold than they actually had. And by doing this, banks could now charge lower fees and even pay people to store gold with them, paying them the interest that they received from loaning this gold out. And this essentially creates a feedback loop of game theory, where the only way to compete in this banking market is to loan out the gold, because people will naturally use the bank which has lower fees than the other bank. And so this led to multiple claims on the same gold, leading really to three issues. The property rights of the savers are violated by giving more than one person a claim to the ownership of the same gold. And it also led to bank runs occurring when the confidence in the bank's ability to make good on all of the claims, leading to some depositors getting everything back and some depositors losing everything. And the artificial reserves that the banks would put into the real economy would increase the money supply and essentially cause credit expansion, therefore harming the gold standard's salability across time and causing inflation. So these paper claims on the gold still had the issue that they had to travel through physical space and could only travel as fast as humans could travel. However, once the telegraph and telephone were invented, transactions could now travel at the speed of light, and this caused a huge gap between the very fast speed of transaction and the very slow speed of settlement, until eventually only the money receipts are traded and not the actual gold itself. And this essentially is the emergence of fiat money. And for fiat to exist, it requires a monopolistic model. Because paper is extremely cheap to produce with no unforgeable costliness, if the free market is allowed to produce this paper at the very low cost and exchange this paper for goods and services with a very high cost, that will eventually lead to hyperinflation, and therefore a monopoly on the production of money is needed. And therefore, despite the extremely low cost of production of fiat, due to this active management, it can retain its value. And this differs to the competitive money model, which has been the norm throughout history, where anyone can produce new units of the money, such as gold and silver, meaning that the value of the money will essentially always fall to its marginal cost of production. Because if a form of money is extremely cheap to make, and you can exchange that money for expensive goods and services, then it is always profitable to produce that money. However, production of the new money units lowers the overall value of the money, therefore making production of that money less profitable until production is no longer profitable and an equilibrium is reached. And this is essentially the difficulty adjustment of nature. And so what is the true value of fiat? Because the marginal cost of production of fiat is essentially zero, the true value of fiat is also zero. And a money with a marginal cost of production of zero will eventually fall to zero and always trend towards zero. And while this monopolistic model of fiat can be maintained for periods of time via active management and via proof of force, overall they still operate within the free market and they cannot escape the competitive market. And fiat inherently requires trust of the monopoly, whereas competitive money is trustless. However, the huge advantage that fiat had was its salability across space. And before fiat money, really there had been no truly saleable form of money across space. And so due to these two things, the active management and preventing it from falling to its true marginal cost of production and its salability across space, it has gained adoption and it has led to complex economies being able to form. And so the philosophical roots of fiat can be traced back to an economist called John Law, who is a Scottish-French economist and is considered one of the key influences of Keynesian economics. And Law had two key beliefs. Money is a tool to be moulded and wielded by the government for policy making, and money serves only as an exchange token or a voucher for buying of goods, and that money has no value in and of itself. And from these two key beliefs, he could deduce, therefore, that money should never be hoarded because it inherently had no value in itself, and that the price of money, not the supply of money, should always be stable for a stable economy, and that in order to achieve this price stability, and centralized banking institutions should be in charge of money and the money supply, which eventually has led to the Federal Reserve. And really, there are two main competing theories of money. The first is the commodity theory, and this theory is believed by Austrian economists, and that is that money has to have intrinsic value, and that the value of the money is given to it by the intrinsic value of the base metal, and also that money arises naturally bottom up, whereas the credit theory of money, or the debt theory of money, and really is the model that won out and influences governments and policy today, is that money is just a measuring stick of credit and debt, and therefore arises by the power of the state. And so under this theory, money is simply an accounting tool to measure debt. Like a centimetre, or like a gram, or like a joule of energy, money is an abstract unit of account and an abstract counting tool, and is no more a real thing than a centimetre or a gram. And under this theory, money is debt, and debt is money. However, there were people who were opposed to this theory of money. So Turgot and Hayek are two notable economists who argue against price stability idealism. So for money to be the most saleable good, its value must vary in response to actual market conditions. And price fluctuations of money act as a natural feedback mechanism, where an increase in the demand for money is met by a fall in prices and an increase in purchasing power, therefore eliminating the need for an increase in the supply of money. And the belief was that attempts to stabilize prices through fiat money are essentially economically unrealistic and lead to unintended consequences. And under this school of thought, current economies act essentially as a pyramid scheme, or even more a Fugazi scheme. And a Fugazi essentially is an illusion. And the belief that the perfect control of money through supply and economic stability through the tool of fiat is a fantasy. And Hayek argued that no one group or person can know all the intricacies of the market, and only the decentralized pricing system of the free market is intelligent enough and efficient enough to better reflect the complexities of the market. And while fiat is saleable across both scales and across space, inherently it is not saleable across time. And that is because the centralization needed to manage fiat leads to inefficiencies and to abuses of power, where expansion of the money supply is essentially incentivized by this centralized structure. And over time, fiat money loses value due to inflation and mismanagement, and due to the fact that you always have to meet the demands of this ever expanding debt in the economy. And without the backing of a saleable commodity to offset the credit, the system's value is not only circular, but essentially empty, and that current economies of fiat, where fiat is exchanged, are trading nothing for nothing, and it is a system of liabilities backed by further liabilities, with essentially no real assets backing the money. And so now we are going to investigate how Casper is saleable across time. And that, as mentioned previously in the video, is measured by the stock to flow ratio. And due to the rapid emission schedule of Casper, its stock to flow ratio rises exponentially, with the current stock to flow ratio being around 9 to 10. And this stock to flow can be compared to Bitcoin by using the emission schedule of both Casper and Bitcoin. And from this, we can see that the stock to flow ratio of Casper will surpass the stock to flow ratio of Bitcoin by 2029, as shown in the graph on the bottom. And cryptocurrencies represent an asset that is more saleable across time than the previous monetary metals that we used. So historically, gold and silver have had a stock to flow ratio of 58.4 and 20 respectively. However, in 2020, the stock to flow ratio of Bitcoin rose to 56, which was just below gold. And after the 2024 halving, Bitcoin's stock to flow ratio rose to 120, making it currently the hardest money that exists. However, this will change in 2029, when Casper's stock to flow ratio will surpass Bitcoin, and Casper will be the hardest money that exists, and will be the most saleable money across time. And this can be explained through a reconciliation of both the commodity theory and the credit theory of money. And this was initially proposed by Lynn Alden in her book Broken Money. And this essentially is a new theory of money, or the ledger theory of money, where money is an accounting tool and money is a yardstick like a centimetre or a gram. and money simply acts as a ledger of goods and services of who is owed what. But because historically monetary metals have acted as the best form of ledger and the most decentralized form of ledger, where no one person or entity controls the ledger, but it is nature that controls the rules of the ledger, that is what gave these monetary metals their value as money, and it's not the inherent base commodity value of the metal that gives it its value as money, but the fact that it is a good, decentralized form of ledger which benefits the most people to use and cannot be controlled or co-opted by one person or entity. This was the most advantageous form of ledger that was adopted through time. And so using the stock to flow ratio, you can actually attempt to model the price based on Plan B's stock to flow price model, and Casper is actually tracking the model fairly closely. However, as the stock to flow ratio rises exponentially, the price model would also predict that the Bitcoin and Casper price rise exponentially, and would predict in the next few decades that the Bitcoin and Casper market capitalization would exceed total global wealth. So inevitably, the stock to flow price model will break down. And perhaps a more accurate or more realistic model is the power law. And the power law model is a model that only Bitcoin and only Casper follow. No other cryptocurrencies follow this model, and no other traditional asset follows this model. And the power law predicts price using the independent variable of time. However, the price prediction itself is not what is important here. Instead, these models show the positive techno-economic feedback loops that both of these assets have. And the positive feedback loop is the change in any given positive direction causes an additional change in the same direction. So, for example, an increased amount of adoption increases the price of the asset, which therefore leads to an increased security through the form of mining. And the increased security therefore leads to more adoption, as it is a safer place to keep your wealth, acting as a positive feedback loop of both Bitcoin and Casper. And this can be shown through the multiple secondary power laws that Casper follows. And these secondary power laws are the number of non-zero balance addresses versus time, the hash rate versus price, price versus addresses with a non-zero balance, hash rate versus time, and also addresses with a non-zero balance versus hash rate. And so the history of money is the history of trying to find the money which is saleable across those three coincidences: saleable across time, saleable across scales, and saleable across space. And previously, no form of money has been able to be saleable across all three of these coincidences, with gold and silver being used for their salability across time, and with fiat money eventually being adopted for being saleable across space, and Bitcoin coming along and being saleable across time and saleable across scales, but due to its scaling issue not being saleable across space. However, Casper coming along and solving the cryptocurrency trilemma, being fully decentralized, fully secure, and fully scalable, and being a proof of work. It means it is saleable across time, it is saleable across scales, and it is saleable across space, and is the first form of money that has been able to solve the money trilemma. And this will be further expanded on in later videos. So thank you very much, guys, for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and also to turn on post notifications. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, cheers.